Hello then, welcome back to this damn-filled idealistic crusade. This is going to be an audio commentary covering the 1964 third James Bond film of the official Eon series, Goldfinger. This is done in the same manner as my previous audio commentaries, so do keep in mind this is not at all professionally recorded and is merely my own thoughts on the film as it unspools, which ranges from production facts and trivia, my own feelings on the film, and various bits of character and scene introspection that I come up with. And so it's basically a mixture of all the things that fly through my head when I watch the films and just odds and ends and whatever comes to mind. So again, this is not a professional track in terms of the recording, and it's simply me talking and usually as fast as I can, and just whatever comes to mind. So again, I hope this is informative and enjoyable. And again, this is not at all meant to be a definitive history by any means. For something on the much more on the professional side, definitely do take a look at the official commentaries, which are worth their weight in gold, pun intended. So with that being said, please grab whichever version of the film you wish and go ahead and cue it to the 0 hour mark at the very beginning. And of course, this is just a rough sync. Different versions have different opening and closing logos, so the timings, they never quite exactly match up. But, again, as long as you're roughly in the same place, you should be able to follow along. I don't always follow the exact screen action, but, and of course, hopefully this is also a nice listen for those who aren't watching with the film as well. I'd also like to note, as I did on the previous two, if you're watching a more modern version of the film, please go ahead and take the time to go to the audio section and select the original mono audio track, because again, the 5.1 remix on this film is actually quite destructive to the original sound design, and Goldfinger in particular, Norman Wanstall himself has bemoaned the fact that the film is now stuck with a sound remix that really undoes a lot of his Academy Award-winning work, because he won the Oscar for his work on Goldfinger. And the early films and their mono mixes in particular were very much harmed in the remixing process. So definitely take the time to always watch Goldfinger with its original mono audio track as it was originally presented in 1964. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and cue up the film. Again, this is a very rough sync, so it's not going to be exactly perfect. Just do the best you can, and I'll do a brief count-in. So in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, press play now. So we were back to the opening titles. This again is the third and final usage of the original Bob Simmons gun barrel. We can tell already that Goldfinger is a different experience, with John Barry's gun barrel music having a richer sound than his From Russia with Love score. And the way this fades out, it gives you that sense that we're in a different world. We have the closing of the dots again, as in From Russia with Love, and that is the last time we will see the Bob Simmons gun barrel. So here we're in the Goldfinger pre-title sequence. You can see going over the wall there, it's an optical shot to match to the oil refinery. And we have the wonderful Bond back in action Barry Q. Now, this, some people have labeled as the point where Bond changed forever, with the gimmick of the seagull on the head as a means of infiltration. I've never minded it. It's a cute gag, but it's just plausible enough. If you look carefully here, the first time we see somebody, you can see there's some gray hair there, so it's probably not Sean the first time you see somebody break the water, and then it cuts to Sean taking the seagull off his head. Now, this is a wonderful moment when we cut immediately from the grappling hook to Bond automatically knocking the guy down. That's a wonderful way to get out of this fast in the editing suite. Again, there's a certain, not quite a breeziness, but such an influx of the cool factor, and sort of removing itself from being fully grounded in reality here in the Goldfinger pre-titles. And then as soon as the lights cut on, we're introduced to a glorious Ken Adams set with the big circular light. And of course, interesting, we'll never see the set again, so why is it such a fancy set? Well, it sets the tone. Here, Bond takes out some plastic explosive, which was a novel futuristic item in 1964. Something that gets lost as the films go on is all of the futuristic items that we see, particularly in the earlier films that were, wowing audiences, are much more commonplace today. So seeing somebody plant a bomb via plastic explosive in 1964 was a real novelty. So Bond climbing back over the wall and revealing the wetsuit, revealing the tuxedo under the wetsuit is one of the iconic moments. A lot of people say this is, too unrealistic, but it's just plausible enough. Everything in Goldfinger doesn't cross over into science fiction or fantasy. Now here you can tell that the staging and the direction is different because the way Bond enters the small nightclub has that humorous edge where he glances at the watch, which is, of course, to time up the explosion, and then Connery has the most nonchalant reaction to a giant explosion behind him. Of course, that was a lovely explosion, but again, using a matte shot to matte in the wall there. Now, a lot of people say that this is a pre-title sequence establishing the whole notion of having a mini-movie before the film that has nothing to do with the story. And while they're right in one context, it actually takes an opening section of Fleming's novel where Bond reflects on his little adventure in Mexico and the killing of the Capungo would-be assassin and how Bond doesn't like killing in cold blood. So it actually visualizes that part of the novel. So it actually does have to do with the story, and Bond leaving here and getting to Miami, well, that's how he gets to Miami. So it's not completely unrelated to the film. It's just most people have never read the novel. And the Capungo assassin is, of course, represented here by the fella behind the furniture over there. Of course, that is the actress Nadja Regin, who played the mistress of Karen Bay in For Much With Love. And here's the famous optical shot where Bond sees the reflection in her eye, which is an iconic moment and is really well done as an optical. It's very impractical and it was very difficult for them to do. This is the fight sequence with some of the really classic Bob Simmons-style moves, particularly the judo throw over the shoulder, which is something he put in a lot of the fights. It's really one of the signature Bond moves. And it's a very close quarters fight. This is something that Guy Hamilton will return to in some of his other Bond films. But again, you can tell there's a distancing from the element of danger. We're already in a slightly different world to the first two Terrence Young-directed films, and that's the key difference in Goldfinger, and that is primarily due to Guy Hamilton coming on board. Bond gets his one-liner, and then we will smash cut immediately into the titles. And it's a nice jump caused in the editing because it's timed by Peter Hunt. Right as the door closes, we jump right into the opening, jarring, brassy chords of Goldfinger. This is the second and final Robert Brownjohn directed title sequence. In the same manner as the For Much With Love title, it's, of course, images of the film this time instead of the credits being projected onto the female form. But here, there's a coldness to it because, of course, we're looking at a woman, beautiful woman painted gold, which prefaces what happens to Jill Masterson later on. And so you have to wonder, okay, is this girl already dead? Because she's being as still as possible, but of course you can notice little movements here and there. The placement of the projection is really well done, and every single shot is carefully designed to follow the contours of the female form. Some of them are on the cheekier side, particularly the golf ball that drops into Margaret Nolan's cleavage. I should mention this is Margaret Nolan, who will appear as Dink in the Miami sequences. But the individual poses are really well, carefully thought out, as is the actual text of the credits, all being in this nice, refined white style. I've always loved the revolving number plates of the DB5 being placed over her lips. Again, all of these little flourishes are so beautifully executed that I rank this sequence right there with the For Much With Love titles. And really, the two Brownjohn titles are as good as the best of Maurice Binder's work, and are frequently undervalued, although they're so iconic they've been lifted from and used in graphic imagery for ever since. But most people associate Maurice Binder as being the primary title designer and forget that Brownjohn did these two. This, of course, is a scene from the helicopter sequence of For Much With Love, so it's a lift. It's the one scene not from the film you're about to see. Here's the shot of the golf ball going down the cleavage. And we see the familiar cast and crew that we have become used to in the previous two films. So that's part of what makes Goldfinger work, is that we had supreme confidence after the first two films, but the key difference being that now the person at the helm has changed. And Guy Hamilton coming on board didn't change everything, but it did assist with the tonal shift that Goldfinger represents. And it being the third film, it built on the success of the first two. So Goldfinger became the film that took the world by storm and became the first Bond film that most people experienced. And it led to Dr. No and For Much With Love being reissued as the most successful double bill of all time. So you could make the argument that Goldfinger built off the success of the first two films, and because of that, it sort of was coming out to a built-in audience. And so all the newcomers were just, coming in because they heard the word of mouth of the people who had seen the young films. So it brings back the idea. One of the great what-ifs of the Bond series is, what if Terence Young had stayed on to direct Goldfinger? And the general consensus is it would have been a lot more like the first two films, and it would have had less of the lavish atmosphere, because Guy Hamilton looked at Bond differently. He looked at Bond as being more of a great entertainment, as opposed to being the life or death struggle that you get in the Terence Young films. And while Goldfinger as a film still follows Fleming's novel with some changes and some improvements in the plotting, for example, there is a complete tonal shift in comparison to the first two films. And I think that comes from several reasons, not just Guy Hamilton, but Hamilton being the chief and most obvious of those. And this is the Miami sequence at the Fontainebleau Hotel. And if you can notice very obviously, there's a lot of process work, because the sequences shot in Miami were some of the first shot on the production. And it's just Guy Hamilton, cinematographer Ted Moore, Ken Adam, and the only actors they had were pretty much Sek Linder here playing Felix Leiter, and Austin Willis playing Goldfinger's ill-fated guard partner. So anyway, that's why all this is processed, because they didn't have Sean, who was still shooting Marnie for Hitchcock. That was the film he did between For Much With Love and Goldfinger, which also I think helped in the greater assurance of his performance as Bond in Goldfinger, because he had the experience to recharge the batteries by doing a really intensive performance for Hitchcock. It's one of his best performances in Marnie, which was made between the two films. And of course, there in the long shot, there is a not too convincing stand-in for Goldfinger. It's actually a really well done blending of the location footage in Miami, the set footage at Pinewood, and the rear projection shots. Peter Hunt did talk about how it was very difficult to get this whole sequence working right because of having to mix and match everything, and some of the projection plates didn't really come off very well. And another thing that makes Goldfinger work is that, yes, you have a new director coming in, yes, there's a new tone, but you have all of the same key crew returning, and they had already done two films. And even Guy Hamilton talked about how he basically came on to the set, and it was rewarding in one way that, it was a crew that just had two successes, but the way he liked to put it, he felt he had to assert himself a little bit, because in some ways they had gotten just a tiny bit complacent when they started doing Goldfinger, and so everybody had to adjust to Hamilton being a different sort of director to Terence Young. I do think Hamilton becomes underrated, because I think most people then want to label him as being a lighter, a director who preferred lighter stories and things, but when you get to thinking about Terence Young directing Goldfinger, while I do think it would have been great to be more in keeping with the first two films, the amount of business that Guy Hamilton developed or ideas that he came up with are just astonishing. Not just in Goldfinger, but in all the films he directed. But just for example, he found all kinds of things. He was the one who found Harold Sakata to play Oddjob. Little bits of business that he fought for that really add a certain element that wasn't there in the first two films. There is a lavishness that, although the first two, the Terrence Young films, the Terrence Young universe, if you want to call it, does have the elements from Fleming's novels about the high life, they don't quite have the 100% larger than life quality that Goldfinger has. And that's something that audiences in 1964 really latched onto and helped make Bond a phenomenon, because you have to keep in mind the audience had been growing, but it wasn't until Goldfinger's release that Bond became the household name. Dr. No was not so very successful in the U.S. From Russia with Love was a little bit more successful, but they weren't really seen here in the States until that double bill reissue post Goldfinger. And again, it's sort of cemented in the general public's mind. When they think James Bond, they think almost always of Goldfinger. And so Goldfinger became the standard of sorts, even though, ironically, it was a one-off, because Guy Hamilton did not come back until 1971's Diamonds Are Forever, when it was decreed to go after a Goldfinger sort of vibe to try and recapture some of the glory days of 1964 and the era of the Bond phenomenon. So it started this sort of constant back and forth ever since, not just with Bond fans and the general public, but with the actual film series and Eon and the whole production of the series itself. This notion of you have the darker, more grounded side of the Terrence Young era and the lighter, more lavish, larger-than-life side of the Hamilton style. And we still have that mixture of light and dark, the yin and yang of sorts, if you want to put it that way, because without question, the two key directors of the Bond series are Terrence Young and Guy Hamilton, and their approaches were entirely different. But Hamilton, although he did favor a style that was more of a general entertainment, the Hamilton films do maintain a dark sense, and they do have a sense of reality and a grittiness that often gets overlooked because people are looking at the lighter stuff and the jokes and the gadgets and things. But it is something to note that the Hamilton era films are not without a darkness, which is still throughout Goldfinger. And again, we're still following Fleming's novel here, but the lavishness of the film comes also from the fact that it had an increased budget over Russia. Goldfinger had an extra $1 million, so it had a $3 million budget. Ken Adam returns to do the production design and the lavish sets. Already we're seeing, we're not even to the showstopper sets yet, and it's already overwhelming the viewer with the as Fleming's Bond would have put it, the glamour of the soft life. Now, already here, even though this is a wonderful tryst Bond is having with Jill Masterson, it lacks that raw sensuality that I like to talk about in the Terrence Young films. And Goldfinger is the first in the series to treat the sexual aspect of Bond with that element of cheeky humor, the winking and nudging at the audience. Now, here's one shot I've always loved. The close-up here of Jill, where she starts to open her mouth a little bit, it is one of the most chilling bits of foreboding and that you get in the entire series, because it's basically, very close to what she looks like in her gold-painted death form. And here we get the line about the Beatles not being listenable to without earmuffs, which, of course, Bond would probably regret later. Now, here's the fun bit where Oddjob is introduced, and, of course, Connery likes to talk about how when Harold Sakata chopped him on the back of the neck, he wasn't quite used to, screen fighting, so he did actually knock him to the floor. So it's one of those fun bits. Once you hear it, you can't not think of it. So Sean is not quite fully acting there. And probably this is what he looked like when he got up in reality. Now, Barry's cue here is already for giving you the foreshadowing that you need. This moment is not going to end well. And here is the iconic reveal of Jill Masterson, which is one of the brilliant strokes of the screenplay and actually showing Jill's death. Because in Fleming's novel, of course, it's merely referred to much later on in dialogue. And of course, there's a strategically placed pillow to cover her posterior there to keep the U.S. censors placated. I'm sorry, the UK censors placated, because the UK censors would be very, very edgy about any sexual content. Wait, I totally messed that up. The U.S. censors, The U.S. censors were crazy about sexual content, but violence was fine, and the U.K. censors were worried about violence, and sexual content was much more approvable. So they had quite a little bit of back and forth with the Bond films, particularly the earlier ones in the 1960s, with not just one group of censors in one country, but all over the place. This, of course, shocked and stunned audiences, although there is a very similar scene in the very underrated Val Lewton horror film Bedlam from 1946, where there is a character painted gold with gold and gilt who dies of skin suffocation. So here we have a transition back to MI6, much like what we get in Dr. No. Now, here in M's office, you look, and as I've said in the earlier commentaries, this is the first time M's office is actually paneled in real wood. You can tell it's a much richer look. The lighting's a bit different, and we have that's down to Goldfinger having a bigger budget and Ken Adam being able to redo M's office from scratch. Now here we have Bond's perhaps one of the most vivid dressing downs of Bond and M's office in one of the M scenes. And we have some of that classic M and Bond paternal relationship that's right out of the Fleming template that he set in all the novels. But it at least is changing it up, so we're not just doing the same thing where Bond comes in and gets the mission briefing and goes. We've got it doled out, so it's not exactly the same as the first two films to keep it fresher. Now, if we talk about the composition, it is a bit different here, but it is very much in keeping with the first two films because, again, we are with Ted Moore's beautiful photography, which has, only become more and more polished. Of course, Goldfinger having the luxury of having a larger budget, also more time and less pressure, so everything is a bit more polished over the first two films. Here, the Moneypenny office scene is another sign of the relaxed atmosphere of Goldfinger, I think, because the way Sean and Lois Maxwell play this time Moneypenny gets to toss the hat. It's a nice new edge to keep the scenes alive and fresh. The audiences by this time were already expecting this had they seen the previous two films, but it gives an edge, keeps it a little bit different. It gives the actors something slightly new to play, to build upon. And here, the M interruption, we actually get to see M this time. That's another nice little touch. This is the introduction of Colonel Smithers and the introduction of the primary plot. Now, this is just a dialogue scene, so it should be boring as all get out, but the way that Peter Hunt is able to cut around to give the scene some energy. There's always been a strange pullback here, where the camera pulls all the way back down the table, and although it is strange to pull out during the start of a conversation, it gives you the sense of space, this wonderful Ken Adams set, which is, far more elaborate than really necessary because, we're not going to see this place again. I know Peter Hunt talked about how he had to work with this scene in particular among a lot of others in the film to as he put it, to make it work. But I think what he was referring to was to try and get Hamilton's style being much looser than the more rugged Terence Young style, how to get it into the editing rhythms that he had established with Terence Young on Dr. No From Russia with Love. And that's why the first three Bond films are so unified and stand at the top of the heap, as it were, of the Bond series, because they're the foundation of not just the series, but the formula that I think it's also key that their editing is so completely unified and similar, even though the style of Goldfinger is different, because different director, different tone. But Hunt really had to work at the footage he was given to get it to fit within that context, the tone of the pacing he had already set. And of course, the MacGuffin of the film being about gold and gold smuggling is a fascinating concept, even to general audiences. So that keeps the plot alive and keeps the audience interested, even though this is, again, just a dialogue scene. When they did Diamonds Are Forever, they tried a similar tack in, it being about diamond smuggling, and there's a similar scene setting up the plot of smuggling, but it's not quite anywhere near as effective because it's following in the wake of Goldfinger doing the same thing. It also, in this scene, and the writing allows Bond to show off some of his own chops and to get a nice input down over the overdose of Bonbois line. Now, that's one of the few fades Peter Hunt employs in the film, but again, whenever he does it, it's at the right moment to give a slight passage of time, but not remove the audience from the situation going on. Here is Desmond Llewellyn's second appearance as Q, and if anything else, the explanation of Guy Hamilton's genius as a storyteller can be most summed up in actually defining the Bond and Q relationship forever, because it was Guy Hamilton who was the person that came up with the notion of Bond and Q's constant back and forth, because as Desmond Llewellyn put it, it was Hamilton who stopped him during the shooting to say, all right, you're doing it all wrong, basically. Q doesn't like Bond. Bond doesn't treat his work with any respect whatsoever, and he destroys everything. And so that element was the missing part of the Major Boothroyd Q character, and that's what sets the audience's expectations and creates more of that interest, because we know this scene is going to come up, and the irritation that Q always has is what makes the character more endearing and makes him something other than just an official, which, Desmond pops up in From Russia with Love, but it's a very small scene demonstrating the briefcase, and we don't get any of that real byplay. Whereas here in Goldfinger, that one addition gives Q a character. That's the character. That's everything. And over time, it develops and grows and changes and has different variations, but that's what sets the tone. That's what gave Q his character. And of course, here on the DB5, it is taken from the novel, but given many, many, many more accoutrements, as it were, upgrading to the DB5 over the DB3. Now, when Q explains everything, originally the idea that Hamilton was going to do was to just skip this part, and then everything was going to be a surprise. But it was Cubby Broccoli, the producer, who told him, no, you have to show everything first. And so that's why they had to come back and shoot the extra inserts, and Desmond Llewellyn had to learn all the extra lines. And so Hamilton later, realized that Cubby Broccoli was absolutely right, because surprise is one thing, but knowing that things like the ejector seat are there when Bond is in danger around Oryx's factory, and obviously the Korean guard gets in the car with him, that the audience is sitting there knowing, okay, well, he's got the ejector seat. When is he going to use it? How is he going to use it? It's going to come into play. This is the moment. So it builds that extra layer of suspense and gets every single person of the audience sitting on the edge of their seat fully engaged with the material, as opposed to a quick shock and a laugh and a surprise. Totally different element. And every time you see the car, it's laden with all of these amazing gadgets, and you're always wondering, waiting, watching, and excited to see when they come into play. That's the necessary element of suspense, and that's what makes the Q gadgets so important, because you're introduced to them first, and you're just wondering when they're going to come into play. This is the famous golf sequence, which allows Bond to confront Goldfinger for the second time. A big part of the novel is Bond encounters Goldfinger 3 times, and that forms the 3 portions of the book, based around a classical criminal quote of sorts about meetings. The first time is happenstance, the second time is coincidence, the third time it's enemy action. So when Bond is caught at the factory, that's the 3rd time, and that's when Goldfinger knows for sure that he's an enemy of sorts. It's very understated when Bond throws the gold bar down without any dialogue, and a great touch here is it causes Goldfinger's putt to just miss. It affects his game just that much. Now, of course, in Fleming's novel, the golf game goes on and on and on for, many, many pages, and is riveting, of course, but you couldn't do that in a film. And, of course, they also had to make sure that everything on screen was understandable, particularly all the lines about strict rules of golf and things like that. So the film does a remarkable job at making this scene effective and charged with energy and quite short, and all the while remaining completely understandable to the entire audience, not just the golf players, but the majority who have probably never played a game of golf. It's also interesting to note that Connery didn't really know how to play golf and learned it for this film, and then became a lifelong avid golfer. So that's always a fun note. And of course, Gert Frobe and Sean did have some training on how to at least look convincing enough, but with Sean that took completely and became a lifelong obsession. Oddjob being the caddy is an addition for the film, and is such a beautiful visual image that's so striking that it just burns itself into your brain, and is a remarkable improvement over the already great scene in the novel. It's one small change. Goldfinger has a normal caddy, but it fits perfectly, and of course that leaves Oddjob to be the one to plant the Schlesinger ball here on the rough. Bit of fun humor here where Bond is already playing Goldfinger by hiding his real ball. The discovery of the Schlesinger 7, of course, sets up Bond's ability to outfox Goldfinger and win the match, because, of course, he can't afford to lose the gold bar, because, of course, it's worth £5,000 and it's not exactly his. Of course, without Bond's internal monologue, you don't get all of the wonderful character introspection from the scene in the novel, where there's even some flashback to Bond's earlier years from not only old friends at the golf course, but some of his own memories about growing up there. And of course, Oddjob places the ball exactly on the edge of the rough in the most perfect shot, which is why Hawker tells Bond, that's his original ball. I'm Arnold Palmer. The entire scene hinges on Sean's smile there in that moment where you know exactly what he's going to do, and it's capped up by the line, "Let's have a little fun with Mr. Goldfinger." And it's again remarkable how an entire 18-hole golf game is condensed down to a few minutes, right down to the skullduggery going about, and then Bond playing along and switching the balls and everything, and keeping it completely moving and not alienating anybody in the audience. Again, with the very sharp photography that's very clean and clear, very well composed, and that's all due to Ted Moore. That was something that Cubby Broccoli in particular always wanted to have in the Bond series, not to have a lot of camera trickery going on. Everything needed to be very visible and clear, and never very diffuse or washed out or anything like that. Of course, the Goldfinger is the last of the Bond films shot in the spherical process before they switch over to scope. It is in the same style and format as the first two films, so the 1:6:6 ratio is pretty much seemingly the preferred compositional ratio. It's been projected, of course, 1:8:5 and 1:7:8 on various video releases, but 1:6:6 seems to be the best intended ratio for it. Of course, the Bonds did go back to spherical for the first two films of the Roger Moore tenure, but they became quickly primarily known as being scope films. But again, that gives Goldfinger a certain intimacy, like the first two Terrence Young films, that we did lose with Thunderball becoming such a giant worldwide production. And Bond's little introduction here basically gives everybody, the manner at which he has won, even though none of us really know all of the strict rules of golf offhand. Barry's score has that nice tinge of humor that matches Hawker's chuckling. And Barry himself felt that Goldfinger was his favorite score that he composed because it was the film where everything seemed to come together, which is the general consensus I think a lot of people have, critics as well, that Goldfinger is where everything solidifies, particularly the Bond formula, the formula of the series to come being the right elements of the pre-title sequence, the balance of humor and darkness, the reliance on Fleming tales, but not staying 100% strictly adherent to what Fleming put on the page, having a great villain, having the multiple women that pop up in the series, having the sacrificial lamb character. These are elements that were in the first two films, but they weren't laid out in a particular ground structure. And it wasn't intended to do this with Goldfinger, but Goldfinger became so beautifully polished and so successful and so iconic almost immediately that it did establish this as a formula. And again, going back to the notion of setting up items and suspense, the throwing of Oddjob's hat, as iconic as it is, its greatest importance is to set up Oddjob as the most amazing adversary that Bond is going to have to come up against at some point in the film. And that is topped off by his crushing of the golf ball, which is apparently something that Connery thought was absolutely stupid. But Guy Hamilton had to, reason with him, okay, yes, I know, but you're going to have to go up against this guy, and he can crush golf balls in his bare hand. So that's going to mean, how the hell are you ever going to fight this guy? And of course, the golf ball crushing gets completely referenced in Octopussy, where Govinda crushes the loaded dice in his hand. There's also something very, very luxurious about Bond impeccably tailored outside the golf course, going over to the DB5. And of course, the early variant of the GPS system, if you will, the maps in the DB5 linked to the homing device, is a technological improvement over Fleming's novel, where the homing device is just connected to a beeper in Bond's car. And so the beeps increase in volume and intensity as Bond gets closer, as he's trailing the Rolls Royce, which does have a nice bit of suspense to it, which you don't quite get the same thing in the film, because the gadget isn't as inherent in your face as is in the novel. But we still get nice shots of Bond following, and there is the one little moment where but he doesn't realize Goldfinger has stopped, and he looks down at the map. But because the dot is so small, I don't know if it's quite as obvious, but that's where he has to stop on the clifftop road. So this is one of the most beautiful sections in any Bond film, the leisurely tail job through the beautiful twisting mountain roads of Switzerland, and followed by this absolutely luxurious John Barry cue. And already here you can tell the pacing is opening up. We have this element of luxury, but had this been a Terence Young film, this would have been nowhere near this drawn out. But it being drawn out allows the audience to shuffle in the seat and get accustomed to this, as if we are in the back seat of the Aston Martin DB5 with Bond. So it is still participatory. Now here's the beautiful moment of Tilly Masterson in the brand new Mustang. Ford had a production deal with Goldfinger, the first of many they had in the Bond series. So this was a great showcase for the brand new Mustang. But Bond being passed by a girl driver at speed is one of his great interests in life. And we get this wonderful comic beat of Bond having to focus back on work, and the classic line, "Discipline, 007, discipline," as if he's channeling M. And here's the moment where he looks down and the dot has stopped moving, so he has to, obviously stop quickly. This is a wonderful shot, very uncommon for the series. It's a long pullback to show the three layers of the road, to have Goldfinger, and then pull back and you have Bond revealed, and then pull back even further to have Tilly revealed on the very top with the sniper rifle. Of course, that's oddly a process shot there of Goldfinger munching the fruit. Hamilton and others talked about having to search for particular shots, locations to get shots, particularly this one of the long pullback. It's interesting that, of course, this sets up that Tilly is not a very good shot, but also it's very interesting that it seems she's using the same AR-7 rifle from For Much With Love. I've always loved how Oddjob just looks up at the gunshot and just kind of smiles, and they don't react to there being, a gunshot in this beatific land. It just, they just get back in the car and drive away. Now, this is a wonderful moment of character. The way that Sean is behind the wheel, chasing after Tilly here, he's almost predatory in a way. He has that nice smirk and smile, passes her on the bend. And this is, again, right out of Fleming's novel, but the way that it's a beautiful character moment for Bond on screen without any dialogue is really wonderful. And he keeps cutting her off, and as he's going to let her come by, he will employ the first of the DB5's gadgets, which is, of course, the tire slashers. Of course, most of the devices were built into some of the various DB5s, but the tire slashers were basically mounted on, and that's why this is all a studio process shot. The magic's actually quite good, but you can tell it's obviously on the studio and the stage instead of on location. But, of course, that's just mounted there on the wheels. It's not actually, going into and out of the car, which is why you don't see it going back in. And then Bond puts on this sort of air, as being the British traveler. So it's a nice bit of interplay. And they do have a bit of fun because the classic James Bond line gets cut off by Tilly being all cold. Of course, Tilly in the novel is, does survive and is hinted at as being a lesbian character who is very fond of Pussy Galore later on. Of course, you couldn't have this in a 1964 film, so they use her character being cold and distant and removed as sort of hinting at that and not being interested in Bond at all. And of course, we get that in spades later on with Pussy Galore's introduction into the film. But this is a nice bit of Goldfinger that doesn't get examined as much as being great for character. This scene in particular of Tilly and Bond in the DB5 and her trying to just pretend to be a simple ice skater and giving a fake name. And of course, Bond isn't buying any of it. He sees her real initials on the case and knows that it's a case for the gun. It's just they know exactly what's going on, but it's all pretense. It's a really beautiful moment for Bond as a character on screen. And it's very short, but it sets up Tilly's character and why she'll pop up later and gives a nice character moment for Bond. So it does show that he is an intelligent man, but able to enjoy even small moments of interplay. Now, this scene here at the gas station was supposed to be the cameo of Jacqueline Saltzman, Harry Saltzman's wife, who was supposed to make cameos in each film as sort of a Hitchcock-inspired good luck charm, but that was essentially left on the cutting room floor. Apparently, Cubby Broccoli objected to the idea anyways, so I believe you might be able to see, I don't think you really can, but she's supposed to be back there somewhere as the attendant of the gas station. But again, getting back to the notion of what if Terrence Young had directed this film, again, this entire sequence would have had a much deeper sort of electric charge to it, like the first two films. Just an interesting stylistic difference. Another thing I should mention is I think another key element of Goldfinger having that different tone is in the writing, because of course Richard Maybaum came back and being the series' primary scribe is most responsible for the classic Bondisms, but the other writer is English writer Paul Dane, who had already written a really great earlier thriller with a nuclear device being the primary plot, but he added a certain element of, most people would say Britishness to what Maybaum had already written, but I think he brought in the greater sly humor, the not just it being tongue-in-cheek, but putting it even more firmly tongue-in-cheek, and helped with Hamilton's style to add and inject this richness into the film. Because ever since this point, the producers and others have tried to recapture the Goldfinger formula, but they never can quite pull it off. And they brought Guy Hamilton back for Diamonds Are Forever, but it wasn't quite the same. And I think it was that missing ingredient, if it were, was Paul Dane being one of the screenwriters. So I think him in particular, his one contribution to the Bond franchise is his work on Goldfinger. I think that does make a nice distinct difference and helps Goldfinger stand out as being its own particular entity within the confines of the series. This is the wonderful sneaking sequence, and of course all of these scenes of Goldfinger's factory are of course the actual stages at Pinewood. So of course you have the exterior in Switzerland, and everything else is Pinewood. Now, this is the scene most people forget about, but this is actually revealing the gold smuggling and how it is done, what the Bank of England could never figure out, which is that Goldfinger melts the gold into the shape of his Rolls-Royce Phantom and makes multiple trips across the world every year, and at each of his installations will melt it down and then have fresh gold to then sell and make a huge profit. And then, of course, just doing that 5-6 times a year, that's how the secret of his amassing of great wealth all of a sudden. Of course, in the novel, it's strongly hinted at that he has ties to the Russian spy organization SMERSH, which, of course, is eliminated from the film because the film series tried to stay out of the political realm and always focused in the early films on making Spectre the primary unseen villain. Now, of course, at this point in the story, Bond has accomplished his mission, and had he gotten back to the DB5 and just driven off, they could have picked up Goldfinger on gold smuggling charges, and that would be that. But of course, then your film would be over. But it's interesting to note that here Bond has actually accomplished his mission. The only reason he's caught is because Tilly Masterson is not good at any of this. But it's a nice moment of suspense, although we can pretty much quickly figure out it's Tilly by the time we see the sniper rifle. But it's very much aided by John Barry's cue. The response time of Goldfinger's Korean army is really impressive, particularly for the 1960s. But this is well staged, and we're given Tilly's backstory very quickly because, of course, she's not going to be with us very much longer. Whereas in the novel, somewhat improbably, she and Bond are kept on by Goldfinger as secretaries for the duration of Operation Grand Slam. The gunshot cutting off the conversation is a wonderful dramatic use of sound, and the sound design in Goldfinger is not often talked about enough, but absolutely crucial to the film's effectiveness and shows a remarkable advancement even on what had come before in Dr. No and From Russia with Love. So like everything else, even the sound design and the sound itself, the mix is far more polished, far more confident, goes even further than what came before. And Norman Wanstall outdoes himself and very rightfully won the Academy Award for Best Sound for this film. And I think in particular, the intricate use of sound effects in the mono track for a 1964 film just really stand out and are still beautifully effective. I've always loved the moment of Tilly cracking up during the smoke screen. Adds a nice human touch, and gets reflected later on with Major Masava and The Spy Who Loved Me during the Wet Nelly sequence. Of course, we get little bits of inherent humor with the Koreans trying to keep up with the fun toys of the DB5. Of course, there are originally more things that we don't see in the film. They did come up with a sort of nail ejector, but they didn't use it in the film because they realized it would probably be too inspirational to perhaps kids and other people who didn't have much of a conscience. They would just be influenced to throw nails all over the road. So wonderful explosion. Of course, slightly reminiscent of the car in Dr. No because it crashes off a cliff. But, of course, that's a pretty big, nice little explosion there for the Pinewood backlot. Of course, the driving sequence is through the iconic Black Park, which is, just down the road from Pinewood, as was the Stoke Poaches golf course where they shot the golf scene. Of course, there had Bond chosen the other fork, I'd been like, why didn't you take the other road? You could have gotten out of here. Same thing. Why exactly Bond stops is sort of left unsaid. I guess we're left to believe that the front of the car has sort of gone off the edge of the cliff. I always thought it was cool how Bond opens the door of the DB5 and uses it as an extra shield. Of course, if you look closely, he's got what looks like a Walther P38 in his hand. So I guess he took the gun from the Korean guard he knocked out, or it's just a production gag. And there is the death of Tilly, which interestingly stops Bond, stops the fighting, and everybody gets quiet. And Bond is able to run over and examine Tilly's lifeless body. And as Richard Maybaum brilliantly pointed out, this is one of those scenes where we've had the fun and everything, but now all of a sudden it's been dragged immediately crashing back down to earth, and we're back in reality. And this beautiful girl has just been murdered, and in a very, very unpleasant fashion. And then this beautiful dramatic shot, the music rises, and Oddjob and the whole crew arrives, looming over Bond, and then Oddjob smiles and has the wonderful dialogue of, ah, ah. And now with Bond walking off, being escorted, the music gives it a sort of intricate, playful vibe, which sets up Bond being able to drive his own car back to the factory. Of course, the cynics of the audience will be like, this has been one of the great mistakes, allowing Bond to drive his gadget-laden car all the way back. But of course, how would Oddjob know that the DB5 has an ejector seat in it? This is the beautiful scene introducing the great supporting character of Goldfinger, the kindly old gate lady who will next be seen toting a machine gun. But the best note of this scene is something that most people overlook. Once she opens the gate, Bond looks over, and then she sort of curtsies at him with a smile, and then Bond is just left to marvel at the absolute ridiculousness of the situation he's found himself in. Now here, he starts to thumb and finger the gear shifter, and he shifts it, and this is where all of a sudden the audience is like, okay, yes, now it's coming into play. And that's the key suspense. Of course, that's just a dummy fired out with air canisters because they couldn't put a real ejector seat inside the DB5. But it works beautifully well. Of course, inside the car with Sean driving around, there's some rear projection shots, which are, obviously how they would have to do it. Of course, coming out with the machine gun, the little old lady is just, it's the right note of hysterical and ludicrous and completely surreal. I've always felt the glass is not up to the usual Q bulletproofing standards, which of course I guess he perfected later on, and would mean that's why the car had to have a bulletproof shield on the rear. The film here is sped up a little bit in some of the shots to make the DB5 come across as speeding around much faster to add an energy, which is really needed. That's something, of course, Peter Hunt was known to do. Now, this is the scene here with the mirror, and it works in the long shots, but in the closer shots, it kind of appears a little dodgy. Guy Hamilton and everyone admitted this scene didn't quite work for them, but it holds up just fine. It's just on closer inspection, it's just a little weird. The shot here of the car coming all the way up to the camera is really great because I'm always shocked that they didn't hit the camera. It just is so close. And this is a shot I've always loved. Oddjob looking up to the mirror and smiling. And this establishes for those who were confused that it was indeed a mirror. And this is a moment that's been lifted a million times of the door opening and the injured person falling out. Of course, that's actually, very much in the style that you get from Rush with Love with the murdered Bulgar agent outside the consulate in the car that Red Grant has left. And this, of course, is the iconic primary confrontation between Goldfinger and Bond. Again, we get this in the novel, this being the third meeting of Goldfinger and Bond, where Goldfinger now knows who he is dealing with, because it's the third instance. And, of course, in the dialogue, you have been recognized. And, of course, in the novel, Bond is strapped to a table and threatened to be shall we say, immobilized by a giant buzzsaw. And it's very dramatic, and we get Bond's internal monologue and his steeling up internally to resist and hold out as much as possible, and cursing Goldfinger. It's a very vivid sequence, but the change in the film to the laser was a brilliant stroke, because of course this is usage of a laser in a film was definitely not something that happened in 1964. They did try to use a real laser, but it wasn't really visible under the studio lights. So John Steers had to come up with this contraption that's beautifully designed, and then the laser beam itself was an optical effect, which is why all of the shots with the laser obviously have that optical degeneration. And then the metal was plated brass, which was polished to look gold, and then it was sort of pre-cut and then burned with an acetylene torch. And there was actually one of the effects men down there having to do it, essentially blind. So there is a degree of Sean's acting here that isn't quite acting, because he is literally strapped on there, and it must have been definitely not the most comfortable position. But what's remarkable about the scene is the tension that's built up, and it's really, really accentuated by Peter Hunt's editing, which builds throughout the sequence with a pacing that isn't in the rest of the film. It's expressly in this one scene, and the succession of shots back and forth not only speeds up, but also slows down in the dialogue, and then speeds up again and slows down. It establishes a rhythm of Bond's panic, and Bond's panic becomes the audience's panic then because of that. So when Bond tries to reason his way out, he's really becoming increasingly desperate. We know it, Bond knows it, and most importantly, Goldfinger knows it. Which is why the key line is not the famous quoted lines, but the other lines, like, "You know nothing, Mr. Bond," and "There's nothing you can talk to me about that I don't already know," because Goldfinger does know everything. And he could have just simply shot Bond, but he decided to kill him in this way to make his failure complete. And then Goldfinger turning away and talking for a while, again, just draws out the suspense as the laser starts to get into Bond's pants. But Bond is able to turn the tables by psychologically manipulating Goldfinger at the line, "Can you afford to take that chance?" And then Barry's score highlights that final moment, because the strings almost have this yearning, because they're repeating the same note over and over and over again, until finally, at the very last moment, even after Goldfinger signals to turn it off, the laser stays on for just an instant longer, and then the music immediately cuts down. But the sequence is capped off here by Kish coming up and pulling a gun and shooting Bond anyway. Of course, it's a tranquilizer gun, but neither the audience or Bond knows that at this moment in time. So with this fade out, it does have a nice element of suspense, because Bond essentially could have just been shot and killed, which is, of course, why he wakes up and thinks that he may be dreaming. This is referenced later in A Moment in the Man with the Golden Gun, where Bond thinks that he's in heaven. Of course, the introduction of Pussy Galore is one of the great introductions in film history, but I've always loved the first shot being sort of hazy as Bond is coming to, and the way that Honor Blackman her mouth twitches a little bit and into a sort of smile that you can see. Now, there is an undercurrent of charm in the on-screen relationship of Bond and Pussy, even in this first scene. And that's an inherent quality that becomes really important later on in the barn sequence, where in essentially getting with Pussy Galore, Bond is able to, turn her over to his side and see the madness of Operation Grand Slam for what it is. But a lot of people have felt that that scene comes on a bit too strong, is maybe a bit forced, but it is set up by the continual byplay back and forth that starts here in their very first meeting aboard Goldfinger's private jet. Of course, also we have the first hintings at, of course, Pussy Galore being a character completely uninterested in men, of course, referenced by the line, "You can turn off the charm, I'm immune." Because, of course, you couldn't talk about lesbianism or homosexuality really in a film, even in 1964. So these were things that the production team was having to skirt around and treat with great care, but also find ways to make it, relatively obvious for those who were, actually paying attention. This is a beautifully designed little set, again, amazingly intricate, and we're only going to see it this one time. Ken Adam is renowned for his giant showstopper sets, of which Goldfinger really has two, but I think he's just as impressive in all the small sets, right down to even having the leather stitching there on the interior of the pilot's door. And I do believe this set was reused for the final jet. They just took everything out and redid it. Of course, seeing the exterior of the plane, it is a model shot, as was still common for films of the 1960s. Having actual real photography of real planes in mid-flight was still a rarity. And, seeing the footage of the B-52 bombers pop up in Doctor Strangelove, it is still mostly a lot of model footage. That, of course, was released in the same year as Goldfinger, 1964. The mention of the attaché case here is one of my absolute favorite Bond inferences because, of course, it's a very slight thing, and audiences who had seen the previous film would know about the attaché case and wonder, would that still be an item Bond could use? Would he still have it? And the mention of it, it's just a nice nod to fans of the previous film, and it's a very blink and you miss it thing. It's not in your face, but I always love the way that my lead pronounces it. It says it, and my attaché case, one small attaché case damaged when opened. So sorry. And then Bond's reply, apology is quite unnecessary. This is another one of the really great small scenes that's really well handled by Guy Hamilton that on paper, it seems almost worthless, but combined with Peter Hunt's editing and John Barry's scoring, Ted Moore's photography, Ken Adams' design, it allows for a wonderful, playful moment of character development. So Bond is just simply, dressing, but he notices all of the peepholes and things and knows that he's being observed and watched and has to, obviously keep out of sight, not just because he doesn't like being spied upon, but because he's going to activate his own homing device, the miniature one that Q provided, which, you may have forgotten about by this point in the film, but is something very important and will allow MI6 and, of course, the CIA, because he's passing into the United States, to pick up his trail and, essentially leave the proverbial trail of breadcrumbs. And he can't do it while being observed. So now when he goes to shave, he has the cheeky moment of covering up the other people with shaving cream. It's a nice little, again, a topper to end the scene. Here, Sean appears for the first time in the iconic Goldfinger gray suit and vest combination, which, when most people think of Goldfinger, and sometimes of Bond in general, and they think of Goldfinger, they think of this iconic piece of tailoring, which is, similar in some ways, but very much different to what we saw in the tailoring style of the first two Terrence Young films. I think it also it highlights the sort of increase in the high life that you get throughout Goldfinger. And, of course, Bond is enjoying the high life here even as a captive. Here the dialogue is about firing a bullet in a plane, causing depressurization and such. And while it seems like just plain dialogue, it is, of course, setting up the finale of the film. And, of course, that in the novel was quite a bit different because Bond is able to get Oddjob sucked out of the plane and then fights Goldfinger barehanded. So, again, the film makes a number of large deviations from the novel while sticking to the main plot. But since Goldfinger is probably Fleming's longest novel and a bit meandering in places, it's very introspective and is a shift from the tone of the earlier novels. So, in some ways, it is kind of fitting that the film is a tonal shift from the first two films, just as Goldfinger as a novel was a sort of tonal shift from the earlier Fleming penned novels. It is also just as interesting to see the film taking deviations and trying to adhere to that stricter sense of time and place, because Goldfinger is practically the same runtime as Dr. No at an hour and 51 minutes. Ironically, for such an iconic film filled with iconic images and having a more relaxed pace to it, it's the exact same runtime as Dr. No at the shortest film of the original series, hour and 51 minutes. Again, keeping to that magic right around or just under 2-hour runtime that Bond films really thrive on. And I think, again, a key element of Goldfinger's success is Peter Hunt forcing these new pieces into the style that he had established, but still allowing them to play on their own. So the identity of Guy Hamilton's style and Paul Dane being added into the writing, the richer aspects of Goldfinger, they're not choked off, they're not submerged in Peter Hunt's fast editing style, but he does find ways to make the film keep continually moving. That's the key. That's the key element of the early Bond films that gave them their identity, gave them their pulse, their heartbeat, their rhythms. And that's why the editing on the first three Bonds is so fundamentally crucial. And while people do talk about Peter Hunt's editing, they don't talk about it enough. As I said in my Dr. No commentary, I think the editing of the first three Bond films is so completely revolutionary that I really do think they are the best three edited films of all time. They have never dated, they play perfectly, and have been influential to generations and are still influential because of just how beautifully they are edited and put together, and their freshness, their modernity has never been diluted, even though now they have gotten, much older over the years. Of course, the fun note about Pussy Galore's Flying Circus, while it is a wonderful, incredible, interesting sight to see all of these lovely gals, coming up with gorgeous hair and matching jumpsuits and things. Of course, the real pilots the production had to get were, cigar-chomping, crop duster pilots. And Guy Hamilton and others love to recount how they would fly around and have to wear these crappy wigs in the long shots and would always rip them off. So, of course, even with an increased budget, Goldfinger was still... they weren't able to rest on their laurels. Goldfinger was not a phenomenon until it came out. So they had more time, they had more money. The film was a bit more lavish. The tone was more lavish. There was a slightly more relaxed atmosphere on the set, as it were. But the creativity factor was still there. And here you have it in spades. So that's another part of what makes Goldfinger so special. You have some of the tightness and all some of the energy of the first two films. You have that same creative spark because everybody still felt like they were doing really great work, but Bond was not an established formula. You didn't have to continually top yourself because you had to do something better than what happened in Goldfinger or Thunderball or You Only Live Twice. You weren't on film number 12. You were on film number 3. It was an entirely different outlook. Now, this is a really interesting thing when you think about it. It's being discussed more and more as people look at Goldfinger more seriously as it gets older. But when you stop and think about it, Bond spends most of the film as Goldfinger's prisoner. And so he takes a passive role as opposed to the active role that we see him in the first two films and in most of the series. And the real struggle in the writing, Mabam especially did discuss that he had to find ways to keep Bond active and give him elements of activity because he is essentially unable to do anything from this point onward until the Fort Knox climax. Now, the shots of the CIA agents and Felix waiting around with, of course, a Ford Thunderbird. And nice that they have a matching Homer tracker in the Thunderbird. Of course, all those sequences were shot in Miami as part of the original shoot, even though they're supposed to be in Kentucky. And of course, Guy Hamilton thought it was funny that they found a Kentucky Fried Chicken, so they shot them in front of that before realizing that eventually the KFC chain would be nationwide. So anytime you see the supposedly Kentucky sequences, as we'll see later in the car-crushing sequence, those were all shot in Miami. Now, this is the first of the Ken Adam showstopper sets, as it were, what's been termed affectionately as Goldfinger's Rumpus Room. It is an incredible piece of design from the wood-lined, all of the pine wood, the no pun intended, pine wood, the usage of stone, reminiscent of the Dr. No sets, but also you can notice all the slatted roofs and the sort of very triangular effect of the ceiling and the walls. Not only is it a bit expressionistic, but it's also, I think, very reminiscent of his iconic triangle-shaped war room set from Dr. Strangelove. So obviously being the same designer in the same year, I think it does share a number of interesting elements of that part of his design atmosphere. And Ted Moore has a lot of fun with the camera placement here. And Guy Hamilton and the staging, of course. And of course, they have to keep everybody placed in certain areas because all of these moving parts of the room. So it's not just an amazing set. It's an amazing set with all kinds of maneuverable parts, like a great toy play set. And Goldfinger has a certain delight in twisting all the knobs. And we get to see all the gangsters assembled here and very amusingly start to panic when the walls move around. And of course, it's all for Goldfinger's elaborate presentation. But of course, they are actually right to be, alarmed, as it were, because this will eventually be their tomb. I've always loved the fact that they left the chair there in front of the map, so it's definitely showing that this was always pre-planned to be Goldfinger's planning room, as if he was preparing for this moment all this time. And of course, it's also been pointed out, again, maybe I'm talking about this as well, the unfolding of Operation Grand Slam, Goldfinger presenting the plot, as it were, to all of the gangsters serves no purpose. Why would he do this? There's no real reason other than it brings the audience in on the caper, as it were. This is essentially taking the place of the setup in a classic heist film and adds an element of suspense because we want to see what happens when Goldfinger tries his plot and tries to actually break into Fort Knox, which of course is the plot of the novel. And by this point, especially if you had read the novel, you would assume that's where the film's going. You would know they've already made some deviations and, of course, had to drastically shorten Fleming's novel because of the length. But you would be expecting that this would be the end-all of Goldfinger's plot, to just break in Fort Knox with the aid of the various gangsters here. But, in a nice conceit, this is how the writers are able to dupe the fans of the novel, exactly in the way that they did in From Russia with Love, by having Red Grant remove the cigarette case. And in the same way they did in Dr. No, by having Dr. No notice that Bond stole the table knife and the lighter and have him put it back. So, of course, this is setting up the nice little surprise that we will get when we find out the true meaning of Operation Grand Slam. This is another one of these small character moments that is so beautifully memorable. And again, there's no dialogue here. I've always loved the title of the cue given to the on the Goldfinger soundtrack for Barry's music cue here, called "Teasing the Korean," which is absolutely perfect. But Sean's presence here is beautiful. The little wink and then the final smile and the sink down. Of course, this is very, on the whole, silly, and no guard in their right mind should be fooled by this, but it's just plausible enough, and it sets up a moment and allows Bond to struggle to escape, but is so beautifully handled that it's little moments like this that become real favorites the more you rewatch the film. And a nice building up the tension there, the kicking of the door. You think Bond is hiding behind the door, and the door slams all the way back. And it's only when you pull all the way back that you see the outlines of Bond, which you may not notice quite at first. And the drop down and the little fight here is actually quite dramatic, very well staged. There's a real tension, and of course there, when the guard is on the ground, it's obviously not the Korean, but actually Bob Simmons himself, who doubled almost everybody, and is one of the key heroes of the original Bond films, who is not credited enough. I thought Bond just simply hides the keys under the blankets there because they don't matter now. And of course, he has claimed a Walther P-38 from the guard, so he is now armed. Also, just so happens he was held just down from the rumpus room, so now he can very conveniently get the Operation Grand Slam lecture and actually be let in on the plan, as it were. Goldfinger's rationale throughout the whole explanation is really funny. I love when he gets frustrated with those who are not believing in him because his plan is foolproof. I've devoted 15 years of my life to it. So the way you could explain away the explanation to the gangsters is, well, he's done all this work. He wants to tell somebody. He wants somebody to see how brilliant he is, and of course, inadvertently, he does this for Bond as well. And here we're getting every single element spelled out so we know what's going to happen. Again, building the key element of suspense and anticipation, because again, we want to see how this is going to play out. And the more details we have, the more things we're expecting. And when we realize the true nature of the plan and its dastardly effects, and the fact that the nerve gas is fatal and so on and so forth, it adds a great lever. It adds so much to the impact of what Goldfinger's plan really means, that it adds to the tension of the final assault on Fort Knox, because Bond is still powerless. He's still held in Goldfinger's power, so what can he possibly do to stop this? And the answer is nothing. So it becomes a nail-biting sequence for the entire audience. But without the explanation of all this, you would just be seeing Goldfinger's army approaching and passing through various places and sectors and getting closer, but you wouldn't have that same absolutely key anticipation and build-up. So it's the same exact notion about displaying the gadgets on the DB5 first before using them. And of course, again, in the novel, none of the gangsters were killed off, and they were actually engaged in Goldfinger's plan, because the plan was actually to rob Fort Knox. Of course, the name of Mr. Solo was in Fleming's novel and everything, but Fleming did help develop some ideas for the series that eventually became The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and his original name of Napoleon Solo was going to be used as the title of the show. But Eon, felt that was infringement, and convinced them to change the name of the show, which is why, of course, became The Man from U.N.C.L.E. Now Bond is going to be captured yet again, and we get reintroduced to Pussy Galore, and the fact that she's a judo expert merely intrigues Bond all the more. Bond doesn't even care about being disarmed at this point, because he's so temporarily flabbergasted and intrigued by this new element. But he's still going to have to play along, but in a sort of, not to say a stereotypical British fashion, he is able to play at it. And also there's a lovely little bit there you may not notice of the Koreans having to try and break in to get the other guy out because they don't know where the keys are. That's a little blink and you miss it moment, but they're all like pushing on the door. This is a great moment of foreboding when Kish appears as a figure of death, and now the rumpus room will close off, and the gangsters' panic will be fully realized as they are sealed in their actual tomb. This is a wonderful moment. And again, at this point, we don't know that they're dying. We just, we think they're being put to sleep because we haven't had Bond reveal the real nature of Delta 9. But John Barry's music and the way this is shot, it definitely, you can tell, even on the first viewing, they're not going to be getting up anytime soon. Also, I love the flashing of the lights, the sort of bluish quality to the light. Very similar to the purple flash you get in the explosion in Karen Bay's office and From Russia with Love. It really adds to the sequence and gives it an extra level of visual suspense, I think. And Goldfinger's nonchalant attitude gives a nice, humorous quality to undercut the previous scene's dramatic qualities in the same manner as Bond's one-liners, because of course Goldfinger gets his own one-liners as well. Of course, it is still a bit incongruous to have a bunch of Korean private army members standing around the whole time. But that is, right out of Fleming's novel, and it is a beautiful visual, particularly their matching uniforms and everything. Of course, Goldfinger would have his own unified private army of sorts. And of course, this is trying to set up Bond passing information to the CIA, and of course, Felix Leiter, using the Homer device so that the CIA will follow it and stop the car and be able to retrieve the note. Now, Goldfinger finds that Bond has heard his entire presentation, and of course, still thinks very much so that Bond is simply bluffing, which of course Bond is, but the possibility of Bond not bluffing is the reason why he has to keep him alive and keep this game going. So it's this psychological playing of the two, Bond and villain, back and forth, is another element that keeps Bond from being completely passive, keeps him being an active figure. And he's also doing this with other characters, and ironically, the one that ends up paying off is Pussy Galore. Had he not tried to psychologically interact and motivate or provoke or deflate all these various characters, if he had not done this with Pussy Galore as well, the ending of the film would be entirely different. So it just goes to show you that other agents, 008 in particular, probably would have handled it differently and been killed or not been able to stop Operation Grand Slam. Now, a little technical note here. When Oddjob turns off the highway, there's a little tiny jump cut that actually is some snip frames. There was a slight camera shake or something. And for a long time on most home video copies, there was a slight jump there that was unintended, where those frames had been taken out due to damage. The way this is staged, when Oddjob fires the one bullet into Mr. Solo and he collapses down, Oddjob's look there and the music coming back in adds this wonderful humorous touch to the sequence that, again, undercuts the darkness of Mr. Solo's assassination there and keeps the flow of the film going. The music having that nice driving force keeps the pace going along with Hunt's editing. But this key element of humor, the way Oddjob's sort of almost smirking to himself the entirety of the sequence, really gives it a good charge to the whole sequence and makes it work. Whereas, previously, had this been done in the same manner as the first two films, would have been handled totally differently. Now, the crushing of the Lincoln Continental was a major moment for the production crew and everyone involved, because this was, a status symbol in America. And here, this British crew came in and completely destroyed one, much to the chagrin of everyone who watched this sequence and everyone who was at United Artists or in watching the dailies, so on and so forth. Of course, a car crusher was a pretty revelatory thing by this point in time. Of course, also, they had to remove the engine, so there was an optical there to black out the bottom of the car as it was brought over. And when they crushed the car, the actual block was so big, it was far too large for the truck and far too heavy, so they had to actually cut it down to a smaller size. But Ken Adam points out in one of the commentaries, you can see the truck go down with the weight, even in that smaller piece. Of course, you almost wonder why there's not like some blood or a hand that pops out when Mr. Solo gets crushed, but you don't need any of that. The whole sequence is beautifully constructed with a sly wit and a charm to it, and there's a certain incredulity to it that you just can't quite believe what you're seeing. It's so fantastic. As Bond says in From Russia with Love, it's so fantastic it just possibly could be true. And of course, we move in closely on the hunk, which has, of course, the $1 million in gold as well. Of course, the actual thing would have been much larger. So again, if you look here, when it goes down in the truck, you literally do see it go down. And of course, this was all shot in Miami, and so Oddjob in the long shots is not Harold Sakata, but actually future producer and co-screenwriter Michael G. Wilson. That was his first major job on the Bond films, being the stepson of Cubby Broccoli, was helping out on the Goldfinger shoot and doubling for Oddjob. And it's a wonderful dramatic moment, and it's just simply Oddjob driving back. Again, this is all Miami, so nothing in Kentucky here. Again, nice usage of a fade transition without disrupting the flow whatsoever. Of course, Gert Frobe was completely dubbed for the film. His English was passable. It did get better over the production, but it was still very difficult to understand. So Guy Hamilton directed him to just speak quickly to assist in the dubbing process, which really works wonders. It's one of the great examples of film dubbing. And again, if you didn't know it was dubbed, you wouldn't know it. You really wouldn't. Peter Hunt became really a master at not only finding the right voice actor, but making it practically seamless in the early Bond films. So, of course, Honor Blackman would like to recount about this scene and others where she had to act against Gert, just speaking so fast, everything that came out was pretty much gibberish. So one can only imagine, what went through everyone's head and having to try and act and play against that. Now, this is another fun moment of absolute joy where Bond is held prisoner, but when we pull back and see just the sheer amount of guards, they don't even bother to close the door anymore because they have so many guards. That, and also they probably still couldn't find the key. Now, this is perhaps, I think, the key Bond villain confrontation in the film, even more so than the famous laser table scene, because you get both the strength of the confrontation of that scene, but the outer civility of the golf scene. And we're also getting the full impact of what Operation Grand Slam really means, plus Bond as a brilliant detective figure, because he reveals what he's been doing while being imprisoned is try to figure out the implausibilities of Goldfinger's plan, which of course is stealing all the gold of Fort Knox would take 60 men, 12 days to load it onto 200 trucks, which is ridiculous, which is actually the screenwriters saying that Fleming's plot was ridiculous and they had to fix it. And as Maybaum put it out, it took Bond 10 minutes to figure this out. It took them weeks to figure out. And the coldness is, who said anything about removing it? There's a pause. You plan to break into the world's largest bank, but not to steal anything. And Bond even starts to put on this air of admiring the depths of depravity of Goldfinger's plan. Not only is he actually going to murder 60,000 people, but actually irradiate the gold inside Fort Knox with a device given to him by Mr. Ling, who Bond saw at the factory and knows as a red Chinese agent. This is a key moment for bonding in character, and I think in a lot of ways, I think this should be another of the scenes used to test potential future Bond actors. I think it's just as important as using the hotel room scene in From Russia with Love. It is a remarkable moment in Connery's performance. He has to put on this layer of civility. He has to sort of almost praise Goldfinger. And Goldfinger even is smiling to himself because he sees that Bond is seeing the genius of his conception of his plan. But Bond is pushing further because he's trying to figure out where the bomb is. But he can't come out and say it. But Goldfinger knows his game, and that's why he then threatens Bond. Should any attempt be made to locate it? Who knows where it might be exploded? So there are many, many levels to this scene, and I think it is often glossed over. Yes, it's giving important plot and information. Yes, it's exposition, just like the scene with the gangsters, but there's so many levels here, and it is the purest Bond-villain confrontation in the film because the villain has the upper hand. Bond is his prisoner. But, of course, he can't kill him because, of course, at this point, they actually are being observed by the CIA. So the other level is that this has all been a setup to show Bond relaxing in front of prying eyes. And again, now we're brought back down to earth because Bond realizes his one method of getting a message out to the outside world has been crushed along with the man whose pocket he put it in. And this is the first time we've really seen Pussy Galore in more of a relaxed atmosphere. Of course, she's not in working clothes and not carrying weapons, but of course has been instructed by Goldfinger to make Bond as happy as possible with whatever that entails. And of course, this whole charade of sorts has placated the CIA or anybody who would be observing. So this is all for show. But sadly for Goldfinger, it gives Bond the opportunity to seduce Pussy Galore inside the barn here. And it is also hinted there by the moment she freezes, when Bond says, too bad hell has to end tomorrow. He's quite mad, So it already suggests that Pussy is having second thoughts and knows that Goldfinger is not really a normal person. Now, this is the pivotal scene that, causes Pussy to change allegiances and switch the gas canisters. But, it is not meant to offend, I don't think, but a lot of people, especially in today's world, can take it that way. But again, I do think that overlooks the byplay, and especially here where we get the fun moment where Pussy gets to use her judo skills to throw Bond around, and then Bond starts to return in kind, and they toss about on this wonderful thick hay, which Honor Blackman loved being able to do because she had said on the Avengers, she was working on concrete floors, so this was luxurious, and this whole scene has become totally iconic for many, many reasons. So this here, again, it's a hard thing to do. It's hard to do a sequence like this and not cause any offense and not make it seem one-sided. But again, I think it has been set up properly enough by all the scenes that have come before it and the little tussle in the hay there, the constant back and forth. And of course, we have the wonderful, now typical Bond-style cutaway to suggest the sexual act of it being the turning of the plane propeller starting up. Gets us out of the sequence quickly and into the final dawn raid on Fort Knox with the starting of the absolutely epic John Barry cue. And at this point, we are seeing Operation Grand Slam taking effect, and we do not know anything about Pussy Galore switching the canisters, so as far as we know, in the audience, everything is proceeding according to plan, and Bond is the same way. The audience and Bond are in the dark completely, so our suspense is being heightened because there's nothing anybody can do to stop this, and this plot is unfolding, and as we will see, everyone around Fort Knox will be, ostensibly put to sleep, but actually killed by the Delta-9 nerve gas, and the plot continues to unfold without anyone to check or stop Goldfinger. I love the cutaways to the other pilots. And every single moment of the sequence is perfectly cut to Barry's music. One of the most interesting parts of the Goldfinger commentary, Sky Hamilton was recounting that in the scoring sessions that he was talking about a piece, but meaning the Dawn Raid piece here, that he felt it was missing something. It needed something. It was a bit more of a driving thing. So Barry actually added the martial drum beat literally on the scoring stage, which really makes the music come to life. The sign earlier, welcoming General Rushan, is an in-joke that was referencing the Army liaison who was very friendly with the production, Charlie Rushan, who helped get many Army contracts and equipment and cooperation with the early Bond films in particular. And he also became such a friend of the production, he has a small cameo in Thunderball, which is a really nice touch. And of course, Sky Hamilton drove around with a platoon and got them to all fall down and play dead in various areas, and they all thought they were crazy. But it's remarkably effective, even though it's literally the same guys, just all driving around the different spots on one afternoon. As Hamilton put it, promise them $5 and a beer and they'll do anything. And it's really remarkable to see the planes flying over. Of course, you can't do that at Fort Knox, but they were able to get enough photographs and hoodwink enough people and twist enough arms to get some of the flyovers, but the actual Fort Knox set they built on the back lot of Pinewood is an astounding replica of the exterior building and the fence area. So that's what they're pulling up to and why they're able to, blow the hell out of the fence and everything. So on the outside, it's a ridiculously close replica, but of course, once we go inside, that's when Ken Adams' imagination takes over. And a lovely moment here in the music is we get another nice build-up, but as soon as the Red Cross disguised army trucks take off, the strings cut out, and we go back to that military-style backbeat. And again, that's what makes that backbeat is the key part of the entire cue, because it keeps the drama unfolding, even though we're not having the big crescendos again until we blow the fence. And again, the suspense level is continually being heightened here because we literally think that Operation Grand Slam is proceeding according to plan, and we see all the bodies everywhere. This is right out of Fleming's novel, where Bond is brought through and they see all the bodies, because they get right up to the gates of Fort Knox in the novel before the army swings in with Felix and everybody. They don't get into Fort Knox at all, because again, the plot of the novel is to actually rob Fort Knox. And a nice bit of extra drama here. We see Felix, who apparently has died. But if you start to think about it, why would Felix be outside Fort Knox anyway? And here Kish will check with the auric spectrometer. Of course, Goldfinger has his own branded equipment. Just a sign of his ego. But of course, it's already zeroed out because, of course, the Delta-9 nerve gas was not used at all. And also, as another nice touch, Bond is actually handcuffed to Oddjob, which means he has no chance of escaping. And of course, that also foreshadows him being handcuffed to the atomic device itself later on. Again, there is something to the way the whole sequence is handled in a sort of understated fashion that adds to this element of you feel like you're watching something happen absolutely for real. Fort Knox is not somewhere that people, even in the U.S., would get to go to because you simply can't. So everything outside being a ridiculously close replica, it's almost as if you're in the real place. And in fact, United Artists got many letters asking how they were able to shoot at Fort Knox, because everybody was convinced it was really the actual Fort Knox. But the understated matter-of-fact vibe here throughout the whole sequence adds to this realistic feeling, because again, it feels like this is happening in real time and we're seeing the full machinations of Goldfinger's evil plan come to life before our very eyes. Again, heightened by the fact that we do not know yet that Pussy Galore has betrayed Goldfinger. And as a nice touch, the laser is brought back into play and is the method by which they will actually break into the interior of Fort Knox by cutting down the garage door. Again, the usage of the laser, the beam itself is an optical, and then the garage door would be cut with an off-screen torch, which is why it has the nice little flame. And that's why the actual every bit of footage with the laser is, an optical, so the footage is a bit degraded in comparison to everything around it. Again, the sound effects throughout the film are really, really important to the overall effect. So even that little moment there of the chains and then the falling of the garage door and the crash when it hits the ground and as it gets dragged off really helps to enhance the sequence. And then we get a nice humming of the other door going up, which if you listen closely actually is from Dr. No. And now we get a nice moment of the helicopter coming in, which introduces the next cue, increases the suspense, and we can see now the bomb has come in. So now the stakes have been raised even further. As Bond wondered where it was, we didn't see any sort of device anywhere, but now it's come in literally from the sky itself. And there's Goldfinger. And Bond is exactly where Goldfinger wants him, because there's nowhere for Bond to go, and all he can do is stand on and look helplessly as Mr. Ling comes in, implants the detonator, and activates the bomb, which will then be wheeled into the vault itself. So again, while Bond is totally passive throughout actually the majority of the film, it's not that he's just standing there not doing anything. He's standing there with his palms sweating and trying to come up with any possible solution whatsoever. And now the vault door opens for the first time. We get our first tantalizing glimpse inside one of the greatest sets in cinema history, which is Ken Adams' Fort Knox interior. And then the great touch of the sliding plate that goes over the floor. And then here, the sound cuts out, and we, for the first time, hear the iconic signature sound of the atomic bomb and the countdown timer. And that usage throughout the entire climax and battle inside Fort Knox, the constant cutting back to that gives us the notion of the ticking clock, but also gives the whole scene its identity. And I think, in particular, the sound design of the final Fort Knox battle is the particular sequence that won Norman Wanstall the Oscar for this film. It is one of the most iconic moments in any film for sound design alone. And as amazing as Ken Adams' visuals are, I think the actual sounds you hear burn themselves into your brain just as much as the visuals of this astonishing set. I love how Goldfinger gets to look and see just the piles of gold, and he must be compelled to just want to fill his coat. I always wonder why he doesn't just grab one bar, just one as a souvenir. Get the lovely touch of Kish looking at Bond with a nice glowering look as he puts the key in his pocket. Of course, that key will become his own downfall as he's locked in and decides to try and break out because, of course, he doesn't want to be left. He's not going to sacrifice himself for Goldfinger's plan. Goldfinger, of course, himself is saved because he doesn't stay to watch Bond go all the way down on the central elevator. This shot gives us a nice time to be able to pull back to see the full grandeur of this astonishing set, just to show you how astonishingly tall it is, taking up an entire soundstage. Again, the sound design is intricate right down to the clanking footsteps and the way that the soldiers start to assault the Korean guards, and you hear through the silence the little groans and things. Goldfinger steps in to ensure that his plan is successful and closes the vault with his two best operatives inside, showing his coldness that he doesn't even try to save them whatsoever. And of course, he thinks of everything, so he's already disguised himself as a general. Cold-bloodedly kills Mr. Ling with, of course, a gold-plated pistol, because, of course, he would have that. And then cold-bloodedly shoots all of the soldiers in the back to then escape in the helicopter. So that's another nice bit of character there that shows his ever-preparedness and his absolute villainy by just, murdering 5 people right there. And this will be the end of Quiche. This is a wonderful moment coming up here where Bob Simmons does the long fall. It's a really beautifully done fall. And they said he almost hit the camera when they did that, but I've always loved the way that he does the dive and his arms come out and he basically somersaults over. And then Bond has to try and maneuver out with the gargantuan bomb. Of course, it can't be a simple small thing as you see in most films. It has to be a beautifully designed gargantuan piece of equipment that's extraordinarily imposing, courtesy of Ken Adam and the rest of the production team. And again, the shot's getting closer as Bond tries to get the key out. It builds the suspense up because we're right in with his desperation. And now Ajab's hat comes back into play. And we get the first of the loud clinkings as it hits metal bars. Again, every single sound effect in this sequence is magnified because there's no music. It's almost like the set is an echo chamber, and everything is scored to the constant ping, 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 pinging of the bomb timer, constantly signaling that Bond is running out of time, except now he's facing off against someone who is seemingly invulnerable, who can take gold bricks to the chest and smile, reacting with no response whatsoever. Now, this really is an astonishing fight sequence. astonishing not just for its effectiveness and its place in the film, but for the fact that the hero is essentially worthless with all his great skills, and it builds upon the previous fight in From Russia with Love, where Bond went toe-to-toe with Red Grant, but here he is no match for Oddjob whatsoever. And that heightens the suspense because it's all in front of a ticking clock, and so Bond has to think on his feet within 3 minutes to defeat someone who is without any vulnerabilities whatsoever. So you see here he becomes a scrapper. He tries to take anything. He takes the big metal lever out of the machinery there and tries to attack Oddjob. And every time he does something, you think, oh, well, that's it. That's how he's going to get him. But every time Guy Hamilton pulls the rug out from under you, and that doesn't work. Oddjob disarms him. Oddjob throws him around more. Oddjob beats the crap out of him. And another one of the sound effects I always remember is when Oddjob throws Bond, every time their feet slide, and then he throws Bond, and Bond slides across the floor over and over and over, and then he crashes up against the bars. Then Oddjob smiling slowly before giving Bond a vicious blow in the abdomen. There is no way out. But it is different from what we got From Russia with Love. It's I think, the key moment that explains the difference between Terence Young and Guy Hamilton. And From Russia with Love, it was a life and death struggle, and we thought to where the audience feels, okay, how is Bond going to survive? Whereas here, it's how is Bond going to get out of this? It's the same setup, but the execution is fundamentally different. It's a different style. Here you think it's going to be Oddjob's hat, and of course he misses. So that's the last of the rugs being pulled out. And here we have Bond's ingenuity, where at the last second he holds the cord up and kills Oddjob via electrocution. And of course, that is really Harold Sakata. He did really hold on and burn himself. And then most impressive, when he falls forward here, it's right onto the ground, which even the stuntman commented it was a very brave thing to do, because that's something stuntmen try to avoid, because it's almost impossible to protect yourself doing a front-forward fall. And now the tension builds up again. Bond has barely managed to defeat Oddjob. Lovely moment there of Kish's body is still there. And he has to try and break into the bomb, uses anything in hand, which, of course, are the gold bars. So, again, his ingenuity is off the charts, and how he's able to figure this stuff out with seconds to go. And there is a little bit of tomfoolery in the editing in stretching out the bomb timer. If you were counting, the bomb would explode long before the disarming actually happens. But that's just dramatic license. The beautiful moment here is when the Korean gets crushed in the door, and we get an extra nice sound effect of his screaming as he gets crushed, which is a wonderful little moment. And now we move in with the battle into the vault as Bond is struggling uselessly to break it open. So as he's doing all this, all these gunshots and the battle is breaking out just overhead of him. And at one point here, one of the Koreans tries to shoot him in the back, and he can't do anything about it, but thankfully the army is there to supervise. And here's a really interesting moment. Bond breaks into the bomb and is left completely clueless at how to disarm it, because it's a complete overload of wires and a maze of twirling doodads and levers, and then the wonderful twisting engine part. And the clock is going further and further and further down. Of course, again, I guess when Bond puts his hand on there, it's maybe meant to symbolize he's able to slightly pause it, maybe a little bit. And I always love how Bond tries to figure out what to do and makes a last-ditch guess and goes to break one of the wires, which probably would have set the bomb off, but is stopped, and they flick the switch over here, which is all he had to do in the first place. Now, this is one of the unintentional gaffes of the film. The 007 timer was not originally there. Originally, it stopped on 003, which is why the line is 3 more ticks and Mr. Goldfinger would hit the jackpot. And, of course, it was Harry Saltzman's idea at the 11th hour, last minute, that the timer should stop on 007. As soon as he said that, everybody goes, well, of course it should. And I actually didn't notice until very recently, the 003 timer did indeed make it into the very earliest prints. So seemingly the first December 1964 prints did have the 003 timer, and by the time we got the prints in the U.S. in 1965, and from then on, everything else was the 007 timer. So that's why the line has always been that way. But if you did see it in the very original release, it probably still did have the 003 timer. So this is formalizing the trend started in From Russia with Love of the final tag ending, if you will, with the villain coming back. Because, of course, by this point, Operation Grand Slam has been defeated, but just a few loose ends to wrap up, such as, where is Goldfinger? Well, that's going to get answered here, but we have a nice interlude where we think, okay, everything's over, got this nice cheery music, and now Bond's gotten on a plane, and he said had some nice banter with Felix, and he's relaxing here. But of course, now we get the iconic moment taken from the novel where Bond will cause the cabin to depressurize. Except here, the phenomenal death is saved for Goldfinger himself. And Connery's reaction I've always loved when Bond twirls around and the charm falls out of his face. And he continues to needle Goldfinger because, of course, he's staring into a loaded gun from a vengeful villain who he's foiled his plans and has to figure a way out of it. So once again is playing this psychological game with Goldfinger and uses it to get the drop on him, which then causes the bullet to fire into the window. And also, if you look closely, Connery starts tapping his finger right before he jumps up, so he's already about to launch himself forward. And we get this nice little fight, although, of course, physically Goldfinger isn't a match for Bond. It's in tight quarters, and now we get the depressurization sequence, which this is an optical here. There had to be some trickery, but we get nice shots of Gert Frobe first on the set and then a dummy being pulled through. And Peter Hunt holds it in the right places before cutting to the plane model struggling, and flying through the air, cavorting around. So it's just enough to create the impression. Now, there on the floor, you see the Korean guard that was standing behind Goldfinger at first. So ostensibly, he got knocked out in the process, but it's just something you don't see. And here, Bond gets to see Pussy again and tries to save the plane. But the tension gets built up because, she says it's no good. And everybody back at the airbase can only watch helplessly as the plane goes down. And then finally, the shot on the radar matched with the music cue, we get the beautiful moment of the extra dot coming off, suggesting the parachute, and then the final crash into the water, which, of course, if you look at the very tail of that, right as the plane hits the water, that's when you can really tell that it's obviously a model, but the fade-in comes in at the right moment. So here is the final fade-out, again, reprising the Bond and leading lady final clinch, as in Dr. No and From Russia with Love, but here with the appropriate humorous edge as we fade out with a final rendition of the Goldfinger theme. And originally, John Barry did have a musical instrumental to end the film, which you can hear on the soundtrack, but here they reprise the title song as we go back into a wonderful custom end title, also done by Robert Brownjohn, on one last image of the Golden Girl. This time, funnily enough, with elements of the pre-title sequence projected on her face. Now, originally, the James Bond Would Be Back credit did supposedly credit On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but due to the wrapping up of the Thunderball court case, the producers were able to make a deal with Kevin McClory, and then it was decided Thunderball would be the next film to be made after Goldfinger, which postponed OHMSS to be done later. So the first of many times where different films were originally supposed to follow and were even credited, but later changed. So this sends the audiences out with one last flourish of drama and being reminded of the amazing experience they have just sat through. Goldfinger is a film that continues to amaze and enthrall to this day. It is a richer experience every time you go back to it than even what you can remember. And its iconic status has never quite been challenged. And I think because it was the film that most audiences across the world became fully introduced to Bond by, it became the de facto standard in a lot of ways, not just for the public's view of Bond, but even the producers, the writers, the key production, all of Eon. Goldfinger literally became a gold standard of sorts. And so that's why its place in cinema history will forever be assured. but it did mark a significant, not so much alteration, but a different tonality was introduced, in addition to the greater influence of the gadgetry and things that we didn't quite have in the first two films. So perhaps Goldfinger's greatest legacy is that it firmly established a Bond formula for the series that we still have today, and became an idea in people's minds. It became, it was great escapism in 1964 for audiences across the globe, but it was a new type of excitement, a new level of escapism that people who had not seen the Terrence Young first two Bond films before, it was their first go-round, and again, like nothing they had ever seen before. So with that, that is my commentary for Goldfinger. Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully my babbling maybe enrich some of your thoughts on the film. Maybe you are going to be able to look at it with some fresh eyes, and I hope this has been informative, and I will continue on with this Bond series of commentaries in the near future. So once again, thank you so much for listening, and I'm humbly yours, the Motion Picture Analyst.